Yo, what's up guys, hope you guys are doing good. So today we are gonna see, what if, Naruto becomes a sorcerer, and met female Zabuza, Naruto X female Zabuza, part 1. So before we start, go check out the author of this fanfic, Chibi-Reaper, link is in the description, and also subscribe to our channel, and like this video. So let's get into the video. Naruto shivered, and rolled to the side, pulling a thin, moth-eaten cloth a tad closer to him in an attempt to ward off the chilly night wind. He was 5, and had just been kicked out of the orphanage he'd been kept in until then, and was not exactly happy about it. Actually, he wasn't quite sure how to feel about it. Sure, the matron had sneered at him, and tossed him into the street with no more than the clothes on his back, soundly berating him for being a useless brat that nobody would ever want to adopt in 1,000 years, but he couldn't help but keep in mind that the orphanage was where the other children were children that would play by beating him until he could barely move, and blame all of their mischief making on him if they were caught. For whatever reason, the matron would instantly take anyone else's side over his, and he would be the one to be punished, even if the other party was obviously in the wrong. Like that time Bert had eaten several fistfuls of strawberry jam, and then fingered him, as the culprit. Never mind that Bert's lips were stained red, and there were globs of jam stuck to his fingers that he'd not bothered to wipe off. It was for that reason that Naruto couldn't muster much more than a mild irritation at being banished from his former home, and probably wouldn't have even felt that much if he'd been given the time to pick up a change of clothes, and the few coins he'd hidden away beneath his mattress. By now, they'd doubtlessly been found by that glutton, and would be used frivolously on sweets while Naruto starved. Damn it, he needed that money. The wind picked up in intensity for a moment, cutting off his train of thought, and sending shivers down the boy's spine, as it easily cut through the thin cloth, and seemed to scrape at his bones. As swiftly as it picked up, it slackened, leaving him shivering lightly. The empty warehouse was better than sleeping on the streets, but the broken windows that had allowed the small boy access did absolutely nothing to keep the wind out. But that was all right. Naruto had plans. In about a month, the Shinobi Academy would be accepting a new crop of hopeful students. He was much younger than the average entry, but he didn't see much other choice. He didn't really want to be a ninja, but, as long as he attended the academy, he would receive a stipend from the Hokage's office even so many years after the IWA war, and the assault of the Yukai, Kyubi, Konoha's ninja forces were still low. The stipend was like a lure drawing in orphans, and the destitute to help fill those ranks, a clever scheme that he was thankful for. The stipend wouldn't be much, but it would cover the rent for a small apartment, the necessary study manual for the classes, and some cheap food. A far better deal than wandering the streets, digging through garbage for half-eaten food. And if he decided to actually become a ninja, then he would be paid even more money, but have to take the risk of being killed by an enemy. He sighed, and rolled over, then paused, as he heard a creaking noise. Where did it come from? He slowly sat up, and glanced around the room. Nobody was there. But there was that creaking noise again. He suddenly realized something, and looked down to the floor he was sitting on. The wooden floor. The cracked wooden floor, which was creaking again. CR was all he managed to get out, as the floor gave way beneath him. He groaned, as he opened his eyes, vision slowly swimming into place. He was in a pile of rubble, dirt, and broken wood. A quick check showed that, miraculously, nothing was broken. In fact, he was completely uninjured save a few scratches and splinters here and there. His luck was not to last. As he looked up, he hadn't fallen too far, but there was definitely no way he could jump high enough to grab the edge of that hole and pull himself out. There was no real way to climb up where he was stuck. The only way he was going to get back to the surface was by following one of the tunnels. He wrinkled his nose as he realized he was in the sewers until he found an accessible exit. At this point, to the casual outside observer, time would seem to freeze, as the young boy glanced both ways, and split in two, a symbol of a fork in the road of life. One would arbitrarily head right, and swiftly find an exit from the sewers. The other? He chose to go left, and so would his life take a different path. Time restarted. Hours later, Naruto was tired, hungry, and sick of wandering the twisting, turning tunnels. He was so upset that he barely noticed when he turned a corner, and walked right through a broken wall, and into a set of caverns. Then he blinked, and glanced around, curious. He wasn't sure exactly where he was, but he was sure he was still somewhere under Konoha, and he had never heard of a system of caverns like this under Konoha. Then again, given that he'd reached those caverns accidentally, through the sewers, it probably wasn't supposed to be common knowledge. Maybe it was a secret exit from the village, in case of attack. That would be good, because if it was, then he would just have to follow it out, and then he could get back to the village from wherever the exit was. Nodding, he began a slow walk through the area when a clicking sound caught his attention. Slowly he turned his head, and stared, going pale. The giant spider stared back at him, with its many eyes. Now, as the terms of giant monster spiders go, this one wasn't really that big. But it was big enough, and a spider roughly half again, as large as he was more than large enough to impress, and terrify, the 5-year-old Naruto. Nice spider, good spider, you won't hurt me, right? A drop of venom fell from its fangs, as though purposely to dash his hopes, and sizzled, as it hit the stone ground. Scree! Adrenaline took over, banishing Naruto's fatigue. As he ran faster than he'd known he could run, the spider only a few short yards behind him. After a moment of running, the scene changed again, to underground Greco-Roman architecture that seemed to be carved out of white marble, and lit by strange, luminescent bluey white rocks embedded in the walls, and hanging in rusty iron cages attached to the roof. It was beautiful, although eerie. Naruto didn't even notice, as he blurred through, running for his life. Gotta away, gotta away. He ended up in a big room, with a large square in the center, and an open door on the other side. In the center of the square was a patch of old, rusty brown stains. He didn't recognize them offhand, but something about them set him off enough that he darted around the edges, losing a few seconds of his lead, but still blurring pretty swiftly through the door, and slamming it shut. At about the same time he did that, there was a big thump sound from the last room, accompanied by a tiny squelch. He turned, and sweat dropped. A ridiculously huge square pillar had just slammed into the floor, matching the square outline perfectly. After a moment it began to rise, revealing the completely crushed body of the spider. With a wince, and a slightly green face, he realized what the rusty stains had been. Then a more important thought hit him. Where was he? He glanced around at his surroundings. This certainly didn't look like the natural caves he'd been in. And it definitely didn't look like the sewers. Scree! 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 Naruto blinked, and his eyes narrowed. It was another spider. This one was even bigger. Scree! Here we go again. Don't fail me now. If he had stopped to think about it, he would be terrified. Being pursued by a monster spider in some buried ruins maze, filled with traps, where every corner he turned could reveal another monster spider or a dead end. But as he ran, he had no time to think about it, only to focus on escaping. Naturally, the third corner he turned ended up being a dead end. Not giving up immediately, he ran all the way down it, hoping there would be a hidden door or a difficult-to-see passage or something. No such luck. He turned momentarily back to the spider, which had slowed down, as though it knew he couldn't escape, and began scrabbling behind himself at the wall in a panic. One of the stones he ran his hands over clicked. Grasping at straws, he pressed it, as hard as he could, and it sank into the wall with a soft hiss. At the same time, a circular patch on the floor began glowing. He was faced with a choice, the giant spider, or the circular patch of glowy stuff on the floor. Some choice. He stepped into the circle just as the spider began its pounce, and disappeared. The surprised beast crashed into the wall, and began scuffling around, trying to find the morsel that had just been there. After a few minutes it scuttled away, the clicking sounds it made possibly being curses in the tongue of spiders. Or perhaps not. Naruto gasped, as he reappeared elsewhere, a glowing circle beneath him slowly fading out. The cavern opened up to show the sky outside. Whoa, that was weird. But I guess it was no stranger than the rest of what just happened. So where am I now? A gust of wind blew past the opening to the cavern. Curious, he stepped out to find himself on a small path with no railing, and looked out, and down, way down. He stumbled backwards, landing on his butt. Wherever he was really high up. Not getting down that way. He blinked, as he realized something. Had there been buildings below? He creeped slowly to the edge of the floating rock, and looked down again. Yep, buildings, and a tower, and faces carved into a MO. Holy crap. This thing is floating directly over Konoha. That begged the question though. If this thing was floating over Konoha, then how long had it been here? And if the ruins were as old as they seemed, then why had nobody noticed it before? A sprinkling of pebbles and dust falling answered the second question at least, as they revealed a slight shimmer in the air that they had to pass through, as they fell. Some sort of illusion, like ninja used? But that didn't really make sense surely. If it was a genjutsu, the shinobi on the ground would notice it every time they looked up. Right. The only answer was that it was either a really well-hidden genjutsu or it was some other kind of illusion. The implications of that one thought were staggering. If it wasn't a genjutsu, then it hadn't been put in place by a ninja. What else was there? Over the entire continent, the only people who could do something similar to this would be ninja. Samurai typically didn't bother with such flashy tricks, preferring to simply cut the enemy to death with their swords. He shook his head, and began up the path around the rock, still tired, but strangely not hungry anymore. The only problem was that the path was thin, and spiraled slowly around the rock, and the winds got fierce at these altitudes. Every couple of minutes he would have to stop, and clutch at the rock face to keep from being blown off. It took much longer, but better than ending up a greasy splat when he hit the ground. The sun had long since set when he reached the top of the rock, and found a tower, apparently carved out of a solid piece of gray marble with white speckles. Not caring about the impossibility of such a huge chunk of marble, he entered, and began looking through the empty rooms. Library, bathroom, another library, something that might be a kitchen, sheesh, another library, here we are. A bedroom. Or at the least, a room with a bed in it. He was asleep before he hit the bed. He woke slowly in the morning, wondering where he was. He remembered that he'd been kicked out of the orphanage, and this definitely wasn't the warehouse he'd snuck into. After a moment of thinking, the whole set of memories returned to him, and he winced. As of now, he had a really strong distaste towards spiders. Shaking the thought off, he sat up. Oddly enough, he still wasn't hungry for some reason. Definitely thirsty, and he really had to pee, but he wasn't hungry at all. He stood up, and began looking for the bathroom when a wicked, evil idea struck him. Even this early, he was a prankster at heart. He left the tower, and stood at the edge of the courtyard where, thankfully unlike the path, there was a hip-high rail neck-high for Naruto. That's better. Almost directly below, Mizuki's brow furrowed in confusion. It wasn't supposed to rain today. In fact, there wasn't a cloud in the sky, and he tugged his wet shirt up near his nose, and sniffed lightly, frowning. Oh yeah, that was good, although now that I think about it, the chances of it actually hitting someone are really low. Oh well. He turned, and got his first good look at the tower, and whistled appreciatively. He couldn't help it, it was damn impressive. The tall, monolithic structure on top of a freaking big floating rock, smack dab in the center of a tiled courtyard with bubbling fountains, and fountains. Fountains equal water. Water! The boy's thirst hit him all at once, and he rushed to the nearest fountain, sticking his face into the pool at the base, and drinking greedily. After a moment he pulled it back out, dripping wet, and sighed in relief. He still wasn't hungry though. Putting the mystery of his disappearing hunger aside for a moment, he went back inside, intent on exploring the tower. After all, until he found a way down, it wasn't like he had anything better to do. The tower had 12, technically 13 floors if you count the roof. The roof was flat, with no guardrails at the edge, and there were small trenches carved into the stone that formed some sort of complex seal out of squares, triangles, circles, and other shapes. Every other floor had roughly 8 or 9 rooms except the base, which had 20-something. Every other room was a small library with over 100 books, and all the others had at least a dozen books anyway. And this was before he found the hidden basement, which had 3 levels, and apparently thousands upon thousands of books, and a robed skeleton sitting at a table in the center. Naruto warily approached the corpse, ready to dart away at a moment's notice. Sure, he knew that dead bodies couldn't move on their own, but before yesterday, he'd also known that the largest any spider could grow was to about the size of a small plate. Having seen that fact of life proven horribly, terrifyingly wrong, he was not prepared to take anything for granted just yet. He was proven correct as, when he got close enough, the skeleton rattled, and there was a deep hiss, as though it was taking in a breath. Naruto froze, as the skull turned towards him, and was ready to do the runaway thing the second it looked like it might attack, but with a slightly softer hiss, and the crackly creaks of bones moving, it reached into its robes, and withdrew a huge book, and set it gently on the table, and then the bones fell into dust. Naruto was content to stare for a moment, and considered leaving, but he brushed the thought off. Where would he go? As far as he could tell, the only way off the rock was through the glowing circle at the base, and that would bring him back to the ruins with the spiders. He definitely didn't want to go that way. And, as nice as this place was, he didn't really want to stay here forever either. The only way to find another way out, if there was another way out, would be to either search every single stone in the tower, which could take months or years, or to find a way to leave in one of the many books in the tower. That too could take a long time, and there was still no guarantee that there would actually be a way out listed in any of those books. As he lifted and opened the skeleton's book, another stumbling block reared its ugly head. Whatever the language written in it was nothing like he'd ever seen before, all squiggly lines and dots. He blinked, as he noticed something else. They were glowing. Instantly alert, he threw it away from himself, as hard as he could, but the book flipped through the air, and seemed to turn to face him, glowing pages beaming a soft light in his direction. He tried to run, but found that he couldn't move, as the book dissolved into a ball of light, and floated to him. As it shifted shape, it circled around his head, extending fine tendrils to wrap around his face. Within seconds they began seeping into him, the thicker tendrils seeking simple access routes through his orifices: mouth, nose, ears, and eyes. The thinner ones slowly made their way through the very pores of his skin. It was painless, something Naruto was incredibly thankful for, as the whole strange process took several minutes to complete, and the strange sensations left where there should have been pain left him quivering on the ground just as surely as pain would have. The target of the tendrils had been his brain. Somehow the book had known that there was no possible way he could read its contents, and had chosen to bypass the problem entirely by carving all the information on its pages directly into his brain. He knew everything that had been written in it, and could dare say that he could read and write perfectly in that strange language, Dark Elvish, as well. It had been the man's journal, before he died. It began by detailing a brief period of time before some sort of experiment, an experiment that had failed, and in the process moved the man's floating tower, and a system of caverns through time and space. The journal listed his suspicions that they had landed on a completely different world from his own. The suspicions were later confirmed. The man had then placed a powerful illusion, and withdrawn into his tower, performing a myriad of baffling and confusing actions in an attempt to replicate the effects of that one failed experiment. Over the centuries, he never managed it. Over time, there were less and less entries on the man's attempts to return home, and more on the strange humans that had begun to settle in the valley below his tower. Naruto noted dimly that he had memorized an in-depth, accurate summary on the history of Konoha from an outsider's perspective, and without the historical bias expected from the town's hero worship of their leaders and more powerful and successful warriors. He also noted that he was thinking in much bigger words than he had before he touched the book. He shook his head. What wasn't important was that the man had actually spoken to people like the Shodaime and Nidaime Hokage, so he had to have a way down, and if the man had a way down, then Naruto could find a way down. Excited, he searched his new memories, only to draw a blank. The man had not once written anything regarding how he reached the ground. Naruto refined his mental search, looking for anything that even hinted at the way down. Nothing, but he turned and looked at a tome, almost as large as he was, sitting on a pedestal. The reference list for the library? It took him a week to skim through the list, periodically checking a few of the listed books, before he found something that might work, but there was, as always, a catch. It was a book of magic, which was an energy similar to, yet different from the chakra shinobi used to make. Also, it was a high-level magic spell, equivalent to a high B or low A ranked. He would either have to study for years or be some sort of prodigy to pull it off. Of course, this is where his legendary stubbornness kicked in. It took him another day to find a book on the basics of magic, and then another 2 after that to read thoroughly through it. What the book took thousands of pages to say could be summed up in a few shorter paragraphs. There were 3 types of magic. Raw, barely focused magic used typically for destruction. Huge gouts of fire, chunks of hail the size of horses, repeated lightning strikes, and the like. Semi-focused magic for more tricky things, like changing something into something else, or levitating things, or levitating yourself, or teleporting long distances instantly. And then extremely focused magic for the really hard stuff, summoning demons, placing wards on things, reanimating corpses as servants, or sealing spells into an object to be used at a later date, just to name a few. The first kind would be learned without any focus at all, just force of will and magical power, as well as the occasional chant or mantra to add focus and power, although with experience that would prove unnecessary. The second would be learned with a wooden foci to force the magic through to distill it, typically a staff, although the book had mentioned that some women preferred wands as an alternative. With dedicated practice, though, the magic could be focused to the point where he could simply use his force of will to channel it for the second level of spells. And then the third was learned with an athame, a ritual knife made of iron, steel, or silver. The metal was apparently even more difficult to channel magic through, and so focused it even further, as well as having the advantage of having a cutting edge for spells that required a blood component. Like the second, the third could be practiced to the point where it could be used with a wooden focus, and supposedly without any focus at all, eventually, though the book claimed that such a feat would take hundreds of years of intensive study and, as such, would be impossible for a human, or any of the other races with shorter lifespans. Naruto shook his head. That seemed much more complicated than what ninja did. He didn't actually know what it was that ninja did, but he had seen one perform once. His hands had blurred, and he had spat out a dragon made of fire. Then again, perhaps he was mistaken, and he had just missed the complicated bit. He picked up 3 more books, listed in the back of the first one, as required reading for the apprentice sorcerer, as well as another dozen that were only recommended, and began to read feverishly. In the Academy of Magics, of the place the owner of the tower Naruto found himself and came from, the standard length of time to become an apprentice sorcerer was about 10 years. Of course, this was taking into account the myriad distractions of the school, alcoholic beverages, late-night parties, and pretty young sorceresses in training just to begin with. In the tower, where there was no food, the only available drink was water, and there wasn't a single human face other than his own. Naruto was able to focus more fully on his studies, so the isolation played a little havoc on his young, impressionable mind, and he began to forget how to relate to other people. So what? The point was that he had compressed a 10-year course of study into just over a single year, and now he was ready to leave. Preparations had been made. He mumbled something under his breath, as he tossed a handful of glittery dust over a runic circle. It glowed with an inner light, as he withdrew his steel athame, and ran his hand over its straight edge. Holding it over the circle, he let fall 3 drops of blood before licking his palm clean. The wound had already sealed over. He didn't know why, but for some reason he healed extremely quickly. It was both interesting, as it opened avenues for blood sorcery that required more than his small body should be able to give just yet, and frustrating, as he could seldom keep a wound open long enough to spill the prescribed amount of blood unless he actually left the athame in the flesh, and even then the wound would sometimes try to seal around the metal. He licked the blood off the blade, as well simply wiping it off with something still left, a trace of blood that unscrupulous sorcerers could use to curse him from afar. The lessons from the books were well ingrained into his mind, and the likelihood of there being any other sorcerers aside from him was disregarded. After all, where there had been one, there could always be more. He sheathed the athame, and went over to the railing, where he withdrew, and extended a telescope. After several minutes of scanning, he found the perfect place for the other end of the teleportation circle. A small rock cavern about a quarter of a mile outside the town's walls, almost completely covered with hanging moss and lichen. The chances of somebody coming across it were extremely low. He closed the telescope, and set it down, then lifted his staff, and slammed it against the ground. He chanted fiercely under his breath, as winds began whipping around him, and a circle of runes appeared below his feet for a moment. With the final word of the chant, his body flashed, and disappeared, reappearing next to the cave. He staggered with the effort it had taken, and stumbled into the cave. 13 minutes. He had another 47 minutes to set up the other end of the permanent teleportation circle before the spell failed for a lack of connection. Withdrawing his athame again, he began feverishly scratching a diagram, and ran into the stone floor. When it was complete, he tossed the glowing powder on it. The diagram glowed lightly, then flashed, indicating that the circles had been connected. He quickly finished it with the prescribed 3 drops of blood, then slumped to the ground. 16 seconds to spare. His stomach growled loudly, and he grinned, as he felt sensations in his stomach that had been missing the entire time he dwelled in the tower. He was starving. The sensation was magnificent. He'd nearly forgotten what it was like to eat. Sure, he'd learned the create food spell about 6 months into his training, but by then he'd forgotten what most things were supposed to taste like. So just about everything appeared looking normal, but tasting like ash and dirt. Except, for whatever reason, tofu and Brussels sprouts. Like every other 6-year-old in the history of existence, he ate tofu and Brussels sprouts, so the spell hadn't seen much use. But now it was time to eat, and to remember what things tasted like so that he could create them on his own. Idly he wondered if they would take gold, as he'd left all the silver and bronze coins he'd found in his other robe. Naruto's disappearance hadn't caused much of a ripple in Konoha's day-to-day life. Sure, the Hokage had been really upset about it, downright furious after he interrogated the matron of the orphanage he'd placed Naruto in, and there had been grumbles around October 10th, when the villagers suddenly realized that their scapegoat had gone astray. But altogether, not much worth mentioning. Naruto's reappearance, however, had caused a rather large stir, especially when the cloak-wearing boy, where had he gotten one in his size? The whispers ran, had plopped himself down at a ramen stand that was on the verge of falling into debt, and being closed down. Ichiraku, ordering a bowl of ramen, and paying with a handful of small gold coins, that had nearly caused a riot of a very different sort. But Ichiraka-san was very large, and had already swept the coins into his apron, and was glaring at the gathered crowds, so they decided on taking a different route towards the goal of some of those gold coins for themselves. But when they turned to collectively leap at Naruto, they found that he was simply no longer there. Sandaime-sama had been so relieved at the return of Yandaime's legacy that he had left his tower, and coincidentally all of his paperwork, behind to track him down, and offered to let him join the academy early, and he had been politely turned down. That well, of course Naruto was free to choose his own path in life, but he'd really been banking on the fourth's legacy becoming a shinobi. Had bets set up about it with the clan heads of various ninja families, and everything. So he'd shrugged, and apparently accepted it, and found reasons to run into Naruto once or twice a day for the next few weeks, and each time strike up a conversation that would inevitably lead to "Are you sure you don't want to join the academy?" So it wasn't exactly subtle. Sue him. He was pretty much out of practice with subtlety and trickery, having gotten used to being able to just order people to do what he wanted. If he wanted Kakashi to squawk like a chicken, or for Guy to run 500 laps around Konoha in a pink leotard, they would. They would privately curse his name afterwards, but they would do it, and do it exactly to the letter. Of course, he would never make such unreasonably pointless demands, so the point was moot. Still, it worked, and after a few weeks of annoyance Naruto broke, and agreed. After all, Hokage-sama had never said anything about graduating from the Ninja Academy, now had he? It was actually simpler than he'd expected to sabotage his own education in the ninja arts. The instructors had been unusually helpful in the matter, grading him especially harshly, sending him the most difficult questions and tests, pointedly refusing to offer him any aid or correct his many mistakes, and unwilling to look below the surface of the matter. At least before Iruka had been instated, as a new instructor anyway. Naruto, well, he didn't hate the man. He was just doing his job. Doing it a bit too well for Naruto's tastes. He seemed to instinctually grasp the fact that Naruto was more than he let on, and would take the time to correct his taijutsu form, make sure he memorized the hand signs correctly, graded him fairly, only sent him tests and questions that could feasibly be completed by one of the others in his class. Naruto had begun to think that the man was Sarutobi's last-ditch effort to make him take being a ninja seriously, as though he would. All that really meant was that he had to make sure he failed the graduation exam spectacularly. The first time, they just run a typical obstacle course that the test he had to make it through silently, a subtle cantrip or two, and the entire thing had fallen apart noisily as he passed through it. His loud and false objections to failing had been ignored. The second time, they tested Kawarimi no, but instead of replacing himself with the log, he'd managed to set both it and himself on fire with an apparently misplaced Tora hand sign. The hours spent recovering from the burns hadn't been fun, but it had been worth it. The third time, he was finally in a class of children all his own age, but didn't care much. Third time was the charm, as they said, so it wasn't like he'd be seeing them ever again anyway. Although he did have problems keeping his title of dead last against that lazy Nara. He just had to fail once more, and then withdraw from the academy after a few days. After all, having been so spectacularly horrible in the academy, it was obvious that the ninja life was not for him. No, this time, the test was on the Bunshin. A simple, intangible clone. This time, he decided to make his failure truly spectacular. The two Bunshin looked normal enough, but just before Iruka could happily announce pass, they fell to their knees, clutching at their heads, and moaning. The instructors watched in awe, as their skulls bulged, the skin over them tearing, then the bone beneath shattering, as the Bunshin brains exploded violently outwards, covering the room in immaterial gore, as the false bodies twitched on the ground. Some of them were in varying states of pale and greenish at the display. He'd really outdone himself this time, hadn't he? Just a simple illusion spell, and a twitch of the wand he kept inside his cloak instead of the larger and less easily hidden staff, and they all saw what he wanted them to see, Uzumaki Naruto fail. He had to suppress the urge to smile, and whistle cheerily, as he left, ignoring the way Mizuki-sensei had oddly stood up, and declared that maybe he should pass. He'd made two clones, after all. It wasn't his fault they'd ever died. He was instantly shot down by all the other instructors, as Naruto had known he'd be. Later, Mizuki cursed softly, as the demon brat was revealed to not be where he was supposed to be. He'd expected him to stick around, and angst over all the other children being congratulated by their parents. Why wouldn't he? This was his third time failing the graduation exam. Why, it was almost like the boy just didn't give a damn about becoming a ninja. He shook off the odd thought. What kind of little brat didn't want to be a ninja? The idea was ludicrous. Still, he couldn't be found. Well, damn. It looked like he would just have to steal that scroll himself, without a convenient scapegoat to take all the blame, while he made tracks. Crap. Naruto was still surprised that nobody had discovered his more sorcery abilities yet. I mean, he only teleported daily back to the tower, as he preferred it over the tiny apartment the Hokage had assigned him. Sure, he would go back every now and again to dust, and move things around in an effort to make it look like someone really lived there. But frankly, the tower was a much nicer place to live, and there were so many wonderful books, mostly on the magical arts. But one would find the occasional tome of philosophy or a goblin cookbook or the diary of an unusually educated barbarian or a scientific study into the mating habits of Naga and merfolk. Naruto had flushed at that one, but read it out of fascination anyway, hoping that this would alleviate the need to have someone give him the talk. Unfortunately, the fact that neither species usually had genitals, as such, meant that it did little more than mar his poor, little, impressionable young mind. But today, he'd learned a new spell, and he needed to test it out. But how? The arrow of flame would be best tested against a living target, but how to choose a target that deserved being punctured with a magical arrow, and subsequently charred to a crisp from the inside out? Time for some divination. He did truly hate that stupid crystal ball, and yet it was so useful at times. He sighed, and removed it from its place in his cloak, glaring at it for a moment before it began to glow with a subtle aura, and rise off his palm. Now, he just needed a suitable poem. A couplet would do, really. Orb of crystal floating free, show me what I wish to see. Simple yet effective. Just how Naruto preferred things. The ball flashed, and revealed the scene. Someone was stealing something. They made it out relatively unseen, but an alarm was raised, as they tried to walk innocently away. The scroll had been noted to be missing. Cursing, the figure broke into a run for the forest, and was revealed for a moment in the moonlight to be Mizuki-sensei? Well, if he's the best target available, he began heading out. It was only an hour or so until sundown, so he had plenty of time to set up an ambush. The scroll is gone. Mizuki has stolen the forbidden scroll. Find him. Kill him. Mizuki? Sounds like something the demon brat would do. The ninja who'd made that last comment barely dodged the kunai sent his way by Sandaime-sama. Find Mizuki, and execute him for this trespass, and return the scroll to me. He can't have gone far. The assembled ninja scattered, and Iruka took a moment to think about things. If he was Mizuki, he would be running, as fast as he could out of Konoha. The nearest exit was that way, and the forest beyond. Iruka started running. Meanwhile, Mizuki had just hit the edge of the forest, and had paused for a breather. Running was one thing. Running with a huge, fragile, 50-pound scroll strapped to his back? Nowhere near so easy, which was why he could be excused for not immediately noticing the rustling of the bushes. He did, however, note the deep growly noise, and turned around and, oh dear lord, what is that? A tendril slammed heavily into the patch of ground he just occupied, lifting from the crater it had left, and swinging it sideways, crashing into a tree, which splintered from the force. A gazer beast. Drawn here, and bound to my service through a 4th-level summon creature spell, if you must know. Gazer beast, the name was apartment. The thing was a floating mass of eyeballs of all sorts set in pulsing pinkish flesh, with tendrils of the same flesh extruding from random areas for equally random distances. Then he recognized the voice. You Uzumaki Naruto! The cloaked boy stepped out of the shadows, cocked his head, and smiled slightly. In the flesh. A hail of metal followed these words, deflecting off of an invisible spherical shield a few feet in front of Naruto. There were brief flashes of light at the point of contact, but nothing else, as the kunai and shuriken fell to the ground. Naruto's smile grew the slightest fraction. Did you really think I would reveal myself without protection, and risk injury? The Tarn's all-purpose shield spell is not the most specialized, and so not the most powerful defensive spell, but it suits the purpose. What kind of ninjutsu is this? The reality of things would take far too long to explain to one who is about to die. Consider them a clan-based style, if you will, currently unusable by anyone in Konoha save myself. Now let's play a game, shall we? I've no doubt you can kill a simple gazer beast, even with just your kunai and shuriken. But after that will come another monster, and another, each more powerful than the last, and sooner or later you will fall. The better you fight, the longer you live. It's that simple. The air around them shimmered, and Mizuki knew that some form of barrier had been set up. Then the gazer beast renewed its assault, and he had no more time to think, only to act. Outside, Iruka had just pulled up to a stop next to the barrier, scratching his head. From this side, it was completely opaque, and there was no way to enter, just like there was no way to leave from the inside, although you could see out. Back inside, Mizuki had completely lost his cool when he noted the one tendril that was phallic in nature. Most experienced warriors could brush such a thing off in favor of killing the monster, but apparently he'd at one point come up against a skilled user, and now his greatest fear was so he'd automatically launched every kunai, shuriken, and other weapon he had against the thing. Unfortunately, in his panic, his aim had slipped. He was lucky if 1 in 5 weapons even hit home, and of those only 1 in 3 had managed to do any sort of damage, from being embedded in an eye. Still, the thing had plenty more, and was only scratched otherwise. It approached the panicking, and collapsed Chunin, and was dispelled with a wave of the hand from Naruto. That was truly disappointing. It seems I overestimated your abilities severely. No matter what, I still get to test my new spell on a live subject. He extended one finger towards Mizuki before he could rise, chanting a line of dark elvish under his breath. Fire, source of all heat and light, gather to me, and fly straight and true. Pierce my enemy's arrow of deadly flame. Mizuki didn't even have time to be surprised at the indecipherable words before the burning dart launched from Naruto's fingertip lodged in his chest. He looked down, staring dumbly, as the oxygen in his lungs ignited. It was not a swift or pleasant death. Naruto arched an eyebrow at the result, a charred corpse with a large cavity in what used to be its chest. Well, that was interesting. Still can't compare to a simple fireball, though. Pity. Maybe I'll try that Minute Meteor Storm spell next. Another wave of his hand, and the barrier fell, revealing a surprised Iruka on the other side. Naruto was just as surprised, but didn't show it, choosing instead to sub-vocalize a minor silver-tongue cantrip before speaking. Here lies a traitor to Konoha, slain by one of her unfavored sons. If you will excuse me, sensei. Wait, you did this, Naruto? How? A quick adaptation of the same lie he'd used on Mizuki was in order. Secret techniques. Only I can use them, as far as I know. I see. Iruka took a moment to kneel next to the corpse, and confirmed that it had indeed at one time been Mizuki, and that scroll over there was, in fact, the forbidden scroll of seals. Then he smiled. Congratulations, Naruto. Naruto frowned. This boded ill. He was correct. As I am a Chunin instructor, as was Mizuki, and, as you've just done a great service to Konoha, and, as you should be rewarded, I'd like to say welcome to the ninja, Genin Naruto. Naruto turned away to conceal the writhing turmoil of emotions on his face at the news of his acceptance into a job that he hadn't wanted in the first place. He still couldn't bring himself to hate the man, but right now he wanted to kill Iruka so much. Be sure to report to the classroom the day after tomorrow. Your Hittite will be delivered to your apartment tomorrow morning. So much, and it would be so easy to just one little fireball, and the problem became, as it were, ash on the wind, and he wouldn't have to deal with it anymore. Mainly because Iruka would be reduced to ash floating on the wind. Sarutobi grinned, as he placed the cloth over his scrying orb. Not his place to watch the joyous gratitude of a student toward his teacher, after all. It was a private thing. Though he did wonder about that odd secret technique he'd used to create that barrier. And what had that monster been? A clan-based summon? But he'd been pretty sure that the Yandame's legacy had been his actual son still. There hadn't actually been any proof of that. Just the uncanny similarities between the child and the village's protector. However, he'd never seen anything like this in the Yandame's family. It seemed like Naruto was from an entirely different lineage altogether. Then that could be a problem. The date of the Kyuubi's attack had been pre-heralded by a peaceful meeting of all villages in Konoha territory. It was an experiment that seemed to have worked well, and would promote a more stable peace between the 5 great nations. For a week or so, the streets had been teeming with shinobi. San-nin would drink in a bar next to Miss Nin, and Rock-nin, while Konoha-nin would give tours of the country to Grass Ninja. At the end of the week, there had been a huge festival just outside Konoha's walls. Granted, the effect had been spoiled somewhat by the distant appearance of Kyuubi. Most of the ninja at this point had immediately left for home, but a few from each village had decided, for whatever reason, to stay behind and help. Thankfully, most of these were the most dangerous kind who'd wanted their crack at a legendary demon. Many of them had displayed secret techniques, and summoned creatures every bit as odd as what he'd just seen while tracking Mizuki. It wasn't infeasible that one of them had brought a wife along, who had gone into labor with all the excitement. In that case, the Yandame might very well have just snatched the first infant he'd come across, which, it seemed, might not have been native to Konoha. Still, The Hokage had to wonder in that case how he had actually learned the secret techniques. Such were, by their very nature, secret. The Hyuga guarded their Juken jealously. The Uchiha had been extremely secretive about the Mangekyo, which had led to disaster. The Inuzuka. The Sandaime had to pause at that. The Inuzuka learned their secret techniques from both the human elders of the clan and the canine ones. Furthermore, their canine partner, or partners, chose them shortly after infancy, and created a bond allowing them to understand each other's speech and, with effort, speak the language of the other. Even if Kuramaru was, thus far, the only canine elder to expend the effort to do so. In that case, did he have an animal companion, similar to the Inuzuka? For a second he considered the gazer beast, and shuddered. No, that couldn't be it. Or not that one at least. Still disappearing for a year, then coming back different. Although he'd never seen an animal with the boy then again, that could just be a protection mechanism. To his eternal sorrow, the villagers would likely be perfectly willing to kill any animal that the demon brat called pet. So it wasn't so unlikely that Naruto might have an animal companion not dissimilar to the Inuzuka, who'd simply decided not to reveal itself publicly. From that, it wasn't such a far leap to imagine that it might very well be this companion who had taught Naruto secret techniques of whatever clan he actually belonged to. Like pieces of a puzzle, many things suddenly snapped together. It all made sense. He was just happy that Naruto had apparently decided to stay here, rather than leave for his own clan, whoever they were. Still, there was one piece of the puzzle missing, even as he labeled Uzumaki Naruto officially as a Hijitsu user. The animal partner itself. He just couldn't bring himself to consider the possibility that that thing was it. Elsewhere, Naruto was sulking. Stupid Mizuki. Stupid Scroll. Stupid Irika. Stupid Konoha. Stupid ninjas. Now he was definitely stuck. In 2 days he would be placed on a 4-man team, 3 genin to 1 instructor joining. This would definitely pose a problem, as he'd never bothered to recall the names of any of his classmates, or interact with them in any way, or acknowledge their existence. It worked for him much better than it did for Duckbutt Hair in the front, who constantly had girls swarming him. Sighing, he took a sip from a mana-replenishing potion that he had handy. Somehow, he got the feeling that he'd need to brew more of these. Oh well, he'd been planning on leaving Konoha, just walking out the gates, and wandering the world. He even had a special transportation artifact crafted. Just set it where he stopped, then teleport back to the tower to sleep, and when he woke up he could teleport back to where he'd left the object. Now, with him being bound to Konoha's service, that left him in something of a bind. Except for certain rare exceptions, Shinobi only left Konoha while on missions. That meant he would be spending a good bit of time here. Which sucked. He blinked, as something occurred to him. As long as they had the money, anyone could hire a ninja for something. Even other ninja. Many of them found that little trick useful. If they didn't feel like walking all the way to the market to buy their own food, or mowing their own lawn, well, there was always a genin to do it. And for a little more money, you could specifically request which ninja you wanted. They could always turn the mission down, but usually wouldn't. So what was stopping him from hiring himself for a mission like, say, go explore, insert random ancient ruin here? Little did he know that he just hit on the secret of how higher level ninja would score paid vacation days. Sure, it would cost them, but they would get plenty of rest and relaxation as they guarded hot springs and festivals. Still, to do that, he'd need more money than he currently had. Gold was all well and good, but if he put in an anonymous mission request for Uzumaki Naruto, but paid in gold, it would be obvious who'd made the request, and it would most likely be denied. This plan required a little more thought to be put into things. He shook his head. If he was going to be a ninja, then he'd end up actively placing himself in dangerous positions. Not good. He'd either need something to boost his own magical power, to ensure that he could keep himself alive and relatively whole, or he would have to trust in his teammates to protect him. Hnark snicker chuckle. Oh yeah, that was a good one. Trust in his teammates to protect him. Instant classic. He'd have to remember that. So, magical power boost it was him. Oh, of course, a familiar. Not only would it be able to siphon and draw ambient energies from the surroundings and convert it into mana for his own use, but if he was fortunate enough to attract something like a hellhound or some large animal through the calling, then it could defend him, as well. He'd even read something about a sorcerer who'd ended up with a baby dragon through the calling. He'd definitely have to read up on some healing spells. Despite his distaste for unnecessary pain, and the fact that his own speed of healing seemed capable of dealing with just about any wound if left long enough, it really wouldn't do for his familiar to up and die on him. But for the calling itself, he'd need to collect some things before he went back to the tower. A few cloves of garlic, a handful of rat tails, a bat wing, a leather pouch filled with flakes of rust, at least 1 gallon of some form of alcohol, a few sprigs of sageweed, and other components. Most of those were stored by the barrel full in the tower, but he'd definitely have to pick up the rust, and alcohol, at least, in town. But how to get it? He was, technically, underage. This would be where a few mental compulsions would come in handy. How fortunate that he happened to be carrying a book on them. The calling itself was a long, complicated matter involving a complicated diagram of green powder, burning most of the components while placing the sake, as it was the most commonly available alcohol, into a small trough, and spilling no less than a pint of his own blood into it in order to create a temporary rift through all levels of time and space to summon a being to serve as a familiar. It was after that happened that things would get tense. The booze was something like bait. Interestingly enough, almost everything capable of performing as a mage's familiar had a taste for alcohol, and if drunk, the blood in the bait would act as a magical catalyst to bind the being to the summoner's service for however long he or she should live. For some of these beings, it would extend their natural lifespan significantly. For others, the time spent, as such would be, as a blink of an eye in the first place, so they didn't really mind. Of course there were several instances where the possible familiar, for one reason or another, chose not to go straight for the booze. Typically in these situations, the being would be quite aggravated at being pulled from wherever it was, and whatever it was doing, so there was a chance that, rather than getting a familiar, Naruto would end up fighting for his life. Keeping this in mind, he chugged a mana potion, and waited for his wound to heal before activating the final rune. He held his breath, as the pattern on the floor glowed, and there was a flash of light, heralding a being crossing through the weave of reality. Naruto stared at the small form glugging down the provided sake. As the flash of light died down, the fact that technically, a full gallon of the liquid should have ruptured all of the tiny being's internal organs, killing it painfully, didn't really register. After all, this was an obviously magical being. Logic, and the laws of physics tended not to apply in the face of magic. That just left the question of just what his new familiar was. What are you? Naruto wondered aloud, having run a mental check for possibilities, and coming up blank. It turned, and grinned, after having finished off the offered bait. What do you think I am, boss? I don't know. Could you give me a few minutes? I'm sure there's a book in here on magical beings somewhere. Okay, so basically I'm what's called a magical mutt, boss, or a chimera if you prefer the fancy term for it. Basically, we're what happens when you mix more than 2 types of magical beings together. Usually that only happens in the labs of crazy wizards. Me, I'm a special case, in that it occurred naturally. I see. I think. So you were born? Well, it's a little complicated, but here's the basic family tree. On one hand, my grandsire was an archangel. You know, big white wings, white robe, halo, fiery sword, the works. But as it turned out, he was far better at hunting out and destroying the perversion of undead than he was at demons. He ended up getting drunk in a bar and being seduced by a succubus, thinking that she was a human barwench. Not exactly so pure, as you would expect a celestial to be, right? Naruto blinked, and began rustling around in his cloak. Excuse me a moment, let's see parchment pen. Ah, here it is. Keep going. The small being frowned for a moment, but shrugged. Magic users were almost as bad as scribes. They seemed to have a driving need to put everything they found interesting onto paper. Well, if you know much about celestial and infernal entities, then you know that this could have turned out to be a very bad thing. But somehow, it worked out well for them. Grandam had never been into the whole minion of evil thing. Grandsire was pretty happy that she wasn't going to stop him from going out and being a purging and wrathful flame in the corrupted lands, and so on, and they both apparently really enjoyed the sags. That probably had a whole lot to do with it. Naruto was scribbling madly. This was magnificent. Now anyway, on my other side we don't talk about grandfather much. He was an incubus, the counterpart of succubi. But unlike Grandam, he really was into the whole forces of darkness thing. In the end, grandsire killed him, but not before he raped and impregnated grandmother. She was a fairy, you know. Actually, I'm not sure why he bothered with her except that she was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and he was bored. Being a fairy, she'd completely forgotten the whole incident after about a week, but the fact was that she was still pregnant. Naruto was still scribbling madly. This was like one of those horrible soap operas. He had to make a study of the social dynamics of the involved parties, and how everything had worked out so well. Anyway, after grandmother gave birth to man, she ended up wandering off. I don't like to say it, but fairies aren't known for their responsibility. So grandsire and grandam ended up raising her alongside their own son. One thing led to another, and the two ended up wedding, and becoming my sire and ma'am. That's fascinating. So in effect, you yourself are 2 parts infernal, 1 part celestial, and 1 part fae? Pretty much, yeah? That did explain the height. She was only a foot or so tall, which would still dwarf her grandmother, as the average fairy was something like 2 or 3 inches. He didn't want to put much thought into the concept of one being forcibly impregnated by an incubus, a demon that could reach 6 feet of height, and more. He very much doubted that it was a simple matter of convenience for the being. Then there were the horns sweeping out from her brow, and back over her head, the whip-like tail that came to an arrowhead point, and the fact that her feet ended in cloven hooves, and that the upper pair of her 4 wings were upside down. While the fact that she had 4 wings was probably a throwback to Fae genetics, everything else was heavily influenced by her mostly demonic heritage. Save one thing. Everything about her, except her oddly large blue eyes, was a soft, gentle white. From short cropped hair to feathery wings, to hide/skin, to the goat-like fur from knees down. He made a note to sketch a picture of her at some point to add to the study. Actually, now that I think about it, I was at a family dinner, and given that grandsire is an archangel, and can travel freely between all realms, he should be arriving right about. Naruto stiffened, and broke out into a cold sweat, as there was a flash of light from behind him, and the sensation of cold metal pressing gently against his throat. It looked like he might well end up fighting for his life after all. Actually, the archangel was more understanding about the matter than Naruto had expected. After all, it wasn't really anyone's fault, just an unnoticed flaw in the spell itself. And now they were bound together, and the spell was unbreakable until one of the two died, and all that, and there was really nothing to be done about it. So no hard feelings, right? That didn't stop him from noting that if the young sorcerer didn't treat his granddaughter properly, then he would have no objections towards ending the spell prematurely. He'd been significantly clutching at the hilt of his sword, as he stated that. Naruto made a note to treat his new familiar with the utmost respect and care. He held no illusions he was a powerful sorcerer for a preteen, yes, but it would be decades before he could hope to do anything but die against even a weak archangel. Given that Sonsan's long black hair had begun to turn gray, indicating that he'd been around for quite some time, it would be something more like centuries before he could match him. Unless he did one of those life-extending rituals, it wouldn't matter by that point. Still, best to get some rest now. Kazumi was exploring the tower, but he'd need to be up in the morning to go pick up that damned headband. So, what do you think of him? He's not what I expected. A chaotic yet neutral alignment, yet obviously not insanely well yet anyway. And it seems he's gotten himself accidentally pledged to the service of that village, whose leader is good, and yet mainly neutral. That bodes well for the future. Even if it is not his first inclination to do good, he can be convinced. I still do not believe that he can be the one. The seer was very clear about the matter, dear. He is the proper age, has trained himself in the mystical arts, and has just summoned and bound our daughter as his familiar. Humph. Now, children, we'll just have to wait and see what happens. It may be that we will not have to intervene at all. Ha! Fat chance of that. The boy was terrified of Son. There's no way he'll make it through the coming trials unaided. Well, I am rather intimidating. And it's not like I couldn't crush most of these trials single-handedly, without use of my sword. But it's the boy who is being tested. And if he's a coward, then he will have to be pressured into the tests. I don't think he's a coward. More wary. He probably knew full well that he was no match for me. There's only so much experience one can gain from reading books, and an inexperienced mage is an easy kill. Experienced ones now. The family meeting degenerated into one of Son's many war stories. Naruto spent enough time the next day in that dinky little apartment that he was there when the nondescript box with the forehead protector arrived. Immediately afterwards he headed back to the tower, planning on researching as many useful spells as possible. After all, the spells were mostly one-shot deals. Memorize them, then cast them, then you'd have to memorize them again. But until cast them, he wanted to be as versatile as possible. 4th, 5th, and 6th level summon creature spells, a snowball spell that wasn't nearly as harmless as the name sounded, a couple variations of the basic chain lightning, as well as an entangling vines, and a nifty little spell that would turn an average tree into a wooden golem, along with a similar one that would do the same for a couple 100 gallons of water, but into an ice golem. The problem with that was that used in hot climates, it would melt within hours. Then he'd gotten a couple more fireball spells, and a few healing ones. So yeah, That day was pretty packed. And now he was in the classroom, and waiting for his ninja team to be announced. His presence would have been objected to by the children that actually wanted to be here, except that the graduation exam had been held in a closed room, so for all they knew he could well have passed. Team 7, Uchiha Sasuke, Haruno Sakura, and Uzumaki Naruto. Jounin Sensei Hatake Kakashi. Team 8, Naruto mentally tuned out the rest. He was with Duckbutt, and pink hair. That was all he needed to know. He called on everything he could remember about those two who wasn't much at all. While Duckbutt was number 1 rookie, and so could probably put up a decent fight, compared to the rest anyway. Pink hair was just brainy, which meant that in a combat situation, she'd be useless. Naruto scowled mentally. He was a magic user, dammit. He was fragile. He needed meat shields to keep the sharp, pointy claws / knives / swords / spears / etc. away from him while he powered up some blast of arcane destruction. These were pathetic. The Uchiha wouldn't last 5 minutes against anything that could be summoned with a 3rd level summon creature spell. And Pinky? She'd die on the 1st level. The point of having a meat shield was that they were tough enough to survive being used as a meat shield. If they die, then you'd have to find another, which would be just fantastic. Naruto forced the sarcasm away, as he sat back to wait for their instructor to arrive. Most of the other kids had left by this time. Pinky seemed to only be interested in talking to the Uchiha, who wasn't interested in talking to either of them, leaving him back in a dark, quiet corner, just the way he preferred things, although he was slightly irritated, as hours passed before the man actually decided to show up. Hell, if he'd known they'd be waiting this long, he'd have brought reading material. Reading material being the diary of the barbarian Hera the Scholarly. That was a girl he would have liked to have met, smart enough to be intelligent conversation, yet beefy enough to serve as an effective meat-shield protector. That was it, protector. After all magic users needed a powerful protector. The fact that she was apparently half-orc would help greatly. He blinked, and halted his partial meditations, as a man with improbable hair stuck his head in the room. Your Team 7? My first impression of you guys, to be blunt, it's pretty bad. Meat on the roof. Wow, that was blunt. Naruto wanted to stab him. He reminded himself that if he got someone else's blood on his athame, it would take weeks to purify it. Himself reminded him that he did, in fact, have other knives available to use. An accord was reached. There would be stabbing at the first available opportunity. So let's introduce ourselves. Likes, dislikes, you know the drill. There was silence, as all 3 kids just stared at the one-eyed man. 2 of them were extremely antisocial. One just didn't want to go first. Actually, she was also kind of curious about the new teacher, as well. So, Sensei? Could you maybe go first, and show us how it's done? Right. I'm Hatake Kakashi. What I like and dislike are none of your business. You're too young to know about any of my hobbies, and, as for my dreams, Sakura just stared at the loopy grin that you could just tell was underneath that mask somewhere. Alright, you next, Pinky? Naruto grinned. On second thought, maybe he could delay the stabbing for a little while. Sakura just frowned, but spoke up anyway. Haruno Sakura. I like that. She glanced at Sasuke, and giggled, causing him to almost imperceptibly stiffen. I hate Inopig. My hobbies are, she giggled again, louder, sending chills down the poor Uchiha's spine. And my dreams, Kaya. Right, wow. You gave out almost as little information as I did. And she was remarkably two-dimensional, he carefully did not say. Alright, you next, brooding boy. The Uchiha one. Naruto blinked. Technically, he wasn't brooding. He just sat in the shade because he preferred to be out of direct sunlight. And he didn't feel like talking to anyone just yet. It hadn't quite hit him just how similar in appearance such actions were to Sasuke's own. Uchiha Sasuke. I like some things, and dislike many more. I have no hobbies, and I wouldn't call them dreams, but more of an ambition. To resurrect my clan, and destroy a certain man utterly, in every way, shape, and form. Kakashi sighed, at this point despairing of receiving any information that wasn't covered in their dossiers. What he didn't know was that Naruto had grown bored, and decided to spice up his own introduction a bit. He was talking before Kakashi had the chance to point at him. My name is Uzumaki Naruto. I wield phenomenal power, and have sociopathic tendencies in its use. It's not to say that I can't understand that there are some obviously wrong uses of my power. It's simply that when my blood starts to heat up too much I stop caring. Even now, I'm focusing on keeping myself calm so as not to go berserk, and accidentally kill you all. I dislike boredom, and tend to alleviate such with my likes, which include reading, experimentation with secret techniques, and large explosions. I haven't practiced any of my hobbies in years, as doing so within Konoha's walls would lead to my summary exile and or execution. As for my dreams, I feel that this is too personal a question to answer, as of yet. Quite naturally, both of his teammates had gone rather stiff and pale at certain of his proclamations, mentally trying to prove he was just spouting bullshit, but finding no evidence of such. There was no real evidence that he was telling the truth either, so he could be joking, but there was no evidence that he'd lied. This was also in the forefront of Kakashi's mind, as well, although he was much better at masking his sudden anxiety, mainly because 3/4 of his face was covered. Had he begun to access Kyuubi's power? No, his chakra seemed normal. Oh, just a joke then. Ha ha ha, good one. He'd just make sure to pound the brat later for nearly giving him a heart attack. Alright, now that we all know each other, there's one more thing to do. Your final examination. Wah, but sensei, did you think that little test before was all? No, that's just to weed out the losers that have no hope whatsoever, as a ninja. No, the real test will be survival training. But sensei, we've already had survival training in the academy. Not like this, you haven't, because you'll have to survive me. 6 sharp, tomorrow morning? And don't eat breakfast. You'll just puke it back up. Kakashi disappeared in a swirl of leaves, but not too far. He wanted to see how they reacted to this. And he was disappointed. Sasuke had immediately headed off one way, with Sakura trailing behind him like a lovesick puppy. Naruto had gone completely the other way. This was just great. How the hell was he supposed to pound the concept of teamwork into these brat skulls? Sakura would gladly do anything Sasuke asked, but would ignore Naruto's existence, so long as he wasn't doing something that couldn't be ignored, like actively putting a kunai to her throat. Sasuke was similar, but would ignore both Sakura and Naruto was just as bad. Why did they always dump the problem cases on him? Every single bloody time, and then they have the gall to wonder just why he'd never passed the team. It was cold. That was easily dealt with, by a minor cantrip that caused protection from elements. Ah, that was better. Let the two plebeians wonder why they were shivering, and he wasn't. They'd probably blame it on his cloak. Tough. If they were dumb enough to come out here in the early morning without something to keep them warm, they deserved to stay cold. He removed the diary from a pocket inside his cloak once the sun rose, not knowing, but suspecting that Kakashi would leave them waiting here for the next few hours. Hours that could be well spent puzzling out the confusing Orsa script. That Hera's handwriting wasn't the best made things more difficult. Hours later, he translated a page and a half, and Kakashi had finally arrived. Pity it was just getting to the good bit, involving barrels of cheese, durgar, and a lava flow. Even when she was completely outnumbered and outclassed, she'd figured out a trap to cut the enemy down to size. And Kakashi was talking. Whoops. Better pay attention. 2 bells. So at best, only 2 of you can pass, although there's a chance that only 1 or none of you will get a bell, and will all be returning to the academy. Naruto raised his hand. Yes? So technically, I could just walk away, and let these 2 become ninja, while I myself was dropped from the program? Yes? Naruto considered the pros and cons of such an action for a moment before nodding and turning away. He made it 3 whole steps before Kakashi's hand clamped down on his shoulder. That was what ninjas, and those in the poker profession, call a bluff. And while I'm impressed that you called it, you're not allowed to leave. You have to at least make the attempt to get a bell. Fine. But I hope you know what you're getting into, sensei. Kakashi considered that for a moment before brushing it off. He was just a genin. What could he possibly do? Famous last words. In any case, you have until this clock hits noon. Begin. Sakura and Sasuke disappeared into the cover of the nearby trees and undergrowth. Kakashi nodded. It wasn't as good as he'd prefer, but it was decent for genin, and he blinked as he realized that Naruto hadn't moved an iota, and seemed to be considering his next move carefully. He tensed his muscles, ready for the attack. There was always one that immediately went this route. Although he was waiting an awfully long time too, he just turned around. It would be most polite to allow the others to attack first. Have fun. Then he sat down under a tree. Kakashi just stared at the sheer whatever off him as, just for a moment, he let down his guard. Though not enough, when Sasuke let loose a barrage of pointy metal, he couldn't perform Kawarimi. Crap. He was faking it. Sasuke took off, in an attempt to find someplace else to hide, heading deeper into the woods. Kakashi sighed, and glanced between the direction he'd fled, and where Naruto was reading an old, leather-wrapped book in the shade of a tree. Then his eyes turned to where Sakura had hidden herself, and he sunshine behind her. Megan, Narakumi no Jutsu. Now to see how she reacted to the Wow. And she was supposed to be a genjutsu specialist in the making? 3.5 seconds of her worst fear, and she was out cold, foaming at the mouth. That really sucked. He shook his head in disbelief. This was shaping up to be the worst set of kids he'd had yet. He shook his head, and decided to try Sasuke next. It only took him moments before he was confronting him in a small clearing. I'm different from the others. That's nice. Shall we begin? For the first few passes of blows it was just pure taijutsu. Nothing special. Then Sasuke began making hand signs, and Kakashi's eye widened at the sequence. No way. No academy student should have the available chakra to Katan, Kakaku no Jutsu. Sasuke couldn't see what happened through the flame, but was pretty sure that would finish things. Except that Kakashi wasn't there when the flames died down. Not in front, not behind, not to the sides, so that left above. Sasuke's gaze shot up, and his eyes widened, as nothing was there. Then a hand grabbed at his ankle, pulling him below the ground. Below. Doton Shinju Zanshu. You're right, you're not like the rest. You're still not that great though. Sasuke stood in rage, buried to the neck in dirt, as Kakashi walked off. They're finished then, Hataki-san? That was quick. Kakashi shrugged. Faster than I expected really. Your turn? A moment. The page of his book flipped. If I'm correct, this test is a hoax. The value of teamwork has been noted multiple times throughout the history of Konoha. The bells are ruse, promoting indecisiveness, and driving a wedge between the team members. If they cannot bridge this gap, and work properly, as a cohesive unit, they fail the test. Kakashi nodded, impressed, and marked a few points by the boy's name in his mental score sheet. He just clearly and succinctly outlined the point of the whole test. Then Naruto placed a marker in his book, tucked it away in his cloak, and stood up. It's really a pity. You see, I've never played well with others. No matter. Perhaps I can show teamwork in another manner. Kazumi, Kakashi blinked, as the strange being appeared in a flash of light. Okay, Hokage-sama had mentioned his suspicions that Naruto might have an animal companion, but he'd really been expecting a dog or cat or something like that. Maybe a fox. This had caught him completely off guard, almost as much as the strange chant. Anacret denarianad el serianistit tiaramoria lineat. Creature, to me, still staring, as a strange glowing symbol, glyph, appeared on the ground, and a large, huge, freakishly big, gorillish, humanoid creature appeared. It was half again his height, carried a club that had seemed to have fashioned itself out of the trunk of a tree, was hairy to the point that it appeared to be thick, matted fur, and its face looked like it had been bashed repeatedly into a stone wall, then partially melted. It's a troll. Let's see if this is teamwork enough for you. Naruto paused, as he considered taking up the act from yesterday again. It was a well-noted fact that most sorcerers either were insane, or feigned insanity. Less questing heroes knocking on your door to ask stupid questions that way. He shrugged, as the troll's club slammed into the ground where Kakashi had just been standing before he'd leapt away. Why not? It wasn't like it would be that difficult. A malevolent leer slid across his face, as Kazumi decided it would be best to watch this fight from the vantage point of that tree over there. Kakashi twisted in midair to avoid a ball of hot, searing flame, attached his feet to the incoming club with chakra, then pushed off with all his might to get out of swinging range, flipping a couple of times in midair to dodge an icicle. Damn. When Hokage-sama had mentioned Naruto knowing secret techniques, he'd not considered anything like this. Really, he'd just been banking on treating him like an Inuzuka having to keep an eye out for a dog waiting to leap from the bushes or something like that. HM hee 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 ha ha ha. My blood is boiling. Let the game begin. Be you player or pawn, Kakashi? Kakashi blinked. This was really bad. Looks like he wasn't kidding about the sociopath thing. This could get ugly. Too late, pawn. Die. The next few minutes were filled with frantic dodging on Kakashi's part. Technically, this would have been made a hell of a lot easier if he could spare a moment to uncover his Sharingan. But most of his mind was being set on avoiding being frozen / electrocuted / set on fire / pierced / crushed. Naruto chanting dai-di-di-di-di-di, and drooling in between various nonsensical words and phrases, some of which he would have sworn were impossible to create with human vocal cords, really didn't help matters. Several more minutes later, the genius ninja had been herded into a trap, and bound with writhing vines that had sprung from beneath the ground. He couldn't move any limb so much as an inch, and that club was coming down. He couldn't help it. His eyes closed, knowing that there was a possibility that he was going to die, and waited for the crushing impact. And waited. and felt a tug at his belt. His eyes snapped open to the destroyed section of the training ground, as the small, winged thing that Naruto had called Kazumi removed the bells from his belt, and flew to Naruto, who was clutching at his head with one hand, but reached out with the other to accept one of the bells. Then he reached into his cloak, pulled out a vial of something bluish that steamed, as he popped the cork loose, and chugged it down. His eyes were notably saner when he finished. Medication, of course. Kakashi would have to keep that in mind. It would really suck to have Naruto lose his antipsychotic meds in the middle of a mission. He wasn't even considering failing him at this point. He'd pointed out the true meaning of the test, and he'd passed it the wrong way. Sure, his personality left a great deal actually to be desired, but Hokage-sama would skin him alive, and use his hide, as a throw ridge if he just let such potential walk away, as he had seemed inclined towards doing earlier. The only trick was finding a way for the other two to pass, as well. He shrugged. It wasn't really important. Just spew a line of bullshit that sounded reasonable. Like, anyway, since the test was for you three to work, as a team, but Naruto got the bells anyway without any help from either of you, I've decided that you all pass, because technically, expending yourselves pointlessly in an effort to make me waste my chakra before Naruto struck the final blow could in this situation count as teamwork. Well done! Bibat-sensei, where is Naruto then? HM? Oh, he left. Considering that he's leaps and bounds ahead of you two in his chosen field, I decided to let him go take a nap while you two wasted time fooling around. Frankly, you two kind of stink. Sasuke slammed his hand into a nearby tree. This is bullshit. I refuse to believe that the class dope could get the bells on his own. Cut the crap, and bring him out. This joke isn't funny. Kakashi sighed. Sasuke. So arrogant, and unwilling to believe in anything that doesn't fit with your own worldview. Did you ever wonder why Naruto might be last of the class? Obviously, he's an idiot. What's there to understand? You also obviously don't look very hard at things. I took a look at the records not once, in the past few years, has he answered any of the questions on the written tests, or turned in a project, or done much of anything at all inside class. Now this, to a lesser degree, isn't exactly an uncommon thing. Everyone ends up missing a test or forgetting to do a project or two in the academy. But all of them, every single one? Like I said, maybe he's retarded, and didn't realize what he was supposed to do. This joke isn't funny. Sai, how about you, Sakura? She kept glancing at Sasuke, obviously unwilling to contradict her crush. Forget about Sasuke. He's proving that he's not the sharpest nail in the tack right now. I want your answer, since this is obviously wrong. She twitched, as though restraining herself from attacking him before she answered. Her buttons were incredibly easy to push. He sabotaged his own records? Yes. Now anyone who can't think for themselves that looks at the records just sees an idiot. Meanwhile, he's training his Hijitsu. Does the dobe have Hijitsu? Sasuke asked, obviously shocked. Sasuke, you're an idiot. Shut up now. Anyway, yes, he has Hijitsu, and a number of elemental jutsu. You didn't think I did all that alone? They looked where he was pointing, and had to admit, that section of the training ground was pretty much completely destroyed. There was a half-melted icicle sticking out of a tree, flames burning on fallen trees, and grass, electrical marks, large impact marks in the ground, and smashing trees out of the way, and a huge patch of withered vines growing out of the ground that they were sure hadn't been there before. Okay, fine. The dobe has Hijitsu. Who cares? Once I have the Sharingan, he's still toast. The fact that his voice began to waver with uncertainty midway through the statement was proof of his nervousness. Whatever. Meeting tomorrow at 6 again. Don't be late. Leaving his students 2 out of 3, anyway stunned, as he shined away. Sarutobi took a deep drag of his pipe, as he mulled over Kakashi's report. It was quite unbelievable, really. Apparently Naruto's new secret techniques had turned him into something of a one-man demolition squad. Naturally, there were weaknesses and flaws as well. Naruto had apparently been bringing his full force to bear towards leading Kakashi into a trap. So if Kakashi had had a partner to work in concert with him, a single attack from behind would have pretty much ended the match before it began. Also interesting was the sheer variety of attacks he produced. For certain, Naruto was versatile. Also, this was just a suspicion from an old man, but it seemed that Naruto couldn't produce the individual effects too terribly often over a small period of time, like how Kakashi could only use his signature move a few times a day, but different somehow, in a manner that still escaped him for the moment. So alone, and outnumbered, even by mere genin, he could be beaten. There would be casualties of course, but it was possible. Still, The most intriguing thing was that Naruto's nebulous partner had apparently revealed itself, or herself, as it was apparently female. Sarutobi couldn't recall there being anything at that festival resembling this Kazumi creature. Then again, given that he'd been in retirement, he'd spent a large portion of the festival drunk out of his mind, so it was entirely possible that he had something like her, and simply couldn't remember. Certain healing potions could ward off the need for sleep, or even remove it entirely. This was not a well-known fact, but it was proven to be true nonetheless, as Naruto spent several hours into the night rememorizing the spells he'd used in his assault on Kakashi, as well as a couple of others to boot. The wondrous word of power, instant depths of uninterrupted slumber, to be precise. Power word sleep for those who prefer brevity over flowery prose in their arcane incantations. Sometime after midnight the potion wore off, and his body began shutting down. He had enough time to stagger to a nearby bed before he lost consciousness. After that, he managed to net a few short hours of slumber before being rudely awakened through cold water. Kazumi wasn't even slightly ashamed of herself, as she casually levitated a second sphere of water over his head, and grinned widely. Wakey, wakey boss, he glared. Your demonic heritage is showing through, I see. Oopsie daisy, I seem to be temporarily losing control over my telekin. I'm up, I'm a fiendish creature. He mumbled under his breath. You're gonna be light, Kazumi chirped, seeming to take no offense. Yeah, I get it. Ninja. What a drag. I'll just go do ninja stuff then. And maybe work out a way to convincingly fake my death. Have fun, Naruto continued grumbling lightly, as he teleported out of the tower. Sakura blinked. Just a moment ago, she'd been sure that she was the first one to the meeting spot. Then she blinked, and now Naruto was there, shielding his eyes, and glowering in the direction of the sun. Too bright, he grumbled, flipping up the hood of his cloak, as he sought refuge in the shade. Sakura began to ask where he'd come from, but caught a glimpse of the approaching Sasuke out of the corner of her eye, and lost all train of thought, as her vision turned into a pink framework of flowers surrounding his face. Sasuke-kun, out of my way, he snarled. You fight me! Now! Naruto sighed deeply, as he leaned against the tree. It's too early in the morning for his crap. Besides that, I just don't feel like it right now. If you won't fight, then it just means it'll be an easy win, Sasuke yelled, as he drew a kunai, and lunged, prompting Naruto to sigh again. You really should cool down. How about a nice nap? His eyes focused, and he brought up a single finger, unconsciously mimicking a figure from Sasuke's past, as he poked at his forehead, mumbling the appropriate incantation under his breath. Sasuke was snoring before he hit the ground. Not 5 minutes, and I already had to use one. Better keep the other in reserve, he mumbled to himself. Sakura didn't hear him, so overwhelmed with shock that her obsession had been taken out so casually. Then a partially evil / partially perverted leer fell over her face, and she began to slowly stalk towards her defenseless obsession. Naruto ignored the way she crept up on the Uchiha's limp form, fingers twitching, as he pulled Hera's journal out of his cloak, and continued the effort of translating it. Mere minutes later, she let loose a howl of anguish and disbelief. Tiny, minuscule, shrimpy, shriveled, dwarfish, stunted, infantile. Oh God, it's horrible. Who could have imagined that Sasuke-kun would be so? She slumped over, the shock at whatever she discovered being enough that she passed out. Naruto flipped the page, casually ignoring the entire sordid display. Kazumi had arrived eventually, cloaked under a minor illusion coupled with a look elsewhere mental effect, both of which he assumed came from the Fey portion of her ancestry. He wasn't sure what she'd been doing in the tower that she wanted him gone first, and he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to know. It was hours after that Kakashi chose to show himself, long enough that the sun was well above the tree line, and his other 2 students had begun to stir. He took the opportunity to demonstrate a Suiton jutsu to Naruto, who privately reflected that it was much like what Kazumi had done to him, save on a somewhat larger scale. Once the 2 unconscious portions of the team ceased gasping and spluttering, and Naruto had marked his place in the journal, and returned it to his pocket, Kakashi explained what they would be doing that day. Naruto's patience, such as it was, snapped. Wait, you want us to do what? Like I said, Naruto, the 4 of us are going to practice our tracking skills in combination with our retrieval and delivery techniques by catching a freaking cat. Naruto frowned deeply, as his mind shot in multiple different directions at once. Not gonna do it. Frankly, I'm disgusted by the very idea, and flatly refuse to participate in any mission where I'm not going to get even the opportunity to kill someone. I'll make you a counteroffer though. Good. He made his point, and if he was reading their facial expressions correctly, mildly disturbed his teammates, and reinforced his insanity. 3 in 1 shot. Listen carefully, cause I'll only say this once. You don't bug me about pointless D-ranks, and I won't set your houses on fire. Sounds like a fair deal? Kakashi took a moment to stare at him through his one visible eye, probably trying to decide whether or not he would attempt such a thing and, more importantly, calculate what his odds were of succeeding. Naruto took a calculated sip of mana potion. A sweat drop rolled slowly down the back of the Jounin's head. Right, like I was saying, the 3 of us are going to practice our tracking skills in combination with our retrieval and delivery techniques by hunting down Tora the cat and returning him to his owner. Naruto smirked victoriously, as the other 2 genins sent death glares at his back. I could set houses on fire, if I wanted to. Sasuke mumbled just loud enough for Naruto to overhear. Uchiha are the best with fire techniques. Naruto's smirk grew wider. The days following went much the same. Kakashi would gently suggest the idea of coming along on a D-rank. Naruto would casually threaten the entire team's life and/or property. The suggestion would be retracted, and he would be left to his own devices for the day. Typically he had to knock out or humiliate Sasuke once or twice a day for flavor, as well. Either he was a glutton for punishment, or he had a real problem with his short-term memory. Frankly, Naruto didn't care which, but he'd reached the point that he was perfectly willing to stab him in the face if he didn't quit being irritating. Or even if he did. Actually, he just made up his mind to stab him the next time they met when he sauntered up to the meeting place. Naruto greeted him by launching a pair of shuriken at his eyes. Sasuke screamed like a terrified little girl, and dived to the side, right into the path of an entangling vine spell. Naruto allowed a creepy leer to fall over his face, as he tugged out a curved silver dagger, and began slowly stalking towards the trapped genin. Sasuke struggled harder, and opened his mouth to scream again, but was cut off, as a loose vine wrapped itself around his face, gagging him. Naruto stabbed for his forehead, and the world went black. When he came to, it was to Sasuke's melodious wails to Kakashi about how he was insane, and should be put down like the rabid dog he was. That's a little rude, don't you think, Sasuke-kun? A little rude? You tried to stab me, you psychotic freak. Well yeah, but in my defense you're really annoying. And I was bored. You know how it is. No I don't. You know why? Because I'm not a psychotic freak. Kakashi felt a weird sense of déjà vu, as his students continued arguing, one calm, and relatively polite, and one being loud, and abrasive. Why was it that he got the feeling it should be the other way around though? He quickly shook it off. Anyway, about that, since it's become obvious that our teamwork has begun to suffer recently, I've taken the liberty of reserving a C rank. Maybe this would interest you, Naruto? Depends. Does it involve rakes, puppies, vacuum cleaners, paint, groceries, or kittens in any way not also directly involved with brutal and fiendish murder? Just a guess, I'm going to say probably not. Sure. Why not? Oh. In that case, allow me to introduce you to the client for this mission, to Zuna-san. We'll be protecting him from C-class enemies, such as bandits and highwaymen, as he returns to the land of waves and finishes building a bridge. A taciturn, smelly old drunk stepped out and grunted half-heartedly at them. Naruto considered him for a long moment. I suppose it's too late to change my mind, huh? Far, far too late. The drunk coughed irritably. You know I am standing right here. Would it be too much to ask that you at least wait until you can reasonably be considered to be behind my back before you talk smack? He was resoundingly ignored by all other involved parties. I regret my hasty agreement. I regret it with the fury of a hurricane. Well, at least it's a change of scenery, right, Naruto? Scenery? Sasuke grumbled, although Sakura looked mildly interested. Anyway, make your preparations, and assemble in 1 hour at the main gates. Kakashi ordered. Assemble in 1 hour. Naruto grumbled. That was what, 3-4 hours ago? Yo! I'm afraid I got lost on the road of life. Whatever. Let's just go, already. Always in such a rush. Don't get me wrong, I'm just bored, as all hell from waiting for you. Oh really? Sakura wondered under her breath, as they set off. Despite how he's grumbling, he actually seems pretty eager. Don't you think? As Sasuke? He grunted, not sparing a moment to glance away from glaring into the back of Naruto's head. Sasuke seems a little angry. Right, Naruto? Naruto? Naruto had completely ignored the girl in favor of staring creepily at the bridge builder. What do you want, you overdressed little runt? A vein pulsed lightly at Naruto's temple. Dunno. Just trying to decide how many bandits I'm going to have to slaughter in order to keep from smothering you to death in your sleep, you stupid old drunkard. Tazuna snorted, ignoring the way Naruto's teammates had gone a much whiter shade of pale than normal, and began making frantic shushing motions. Ha! You talk big, runt, but I don't think you have the stones to do anything to your employer. Oh really? Burn! Naruto unleashed a low-level spell, blasting a cone of flame out from his palm that would have rendered Tazuna into a charred husk if Kakashi hadn't chosen just that moment to blur over and remove him to safety, charring the edges of his clothes slightly in the process. Alright, mission rule number 1. Naruto, no murdering the client. Rule number 2, Tazuna, don't taunt the shinobi on antipsychotics. I'll remember that, Tazuna mumbled, obviously shaken by his unexpected brush with fiery death. Sasuke and Sakura sighed in relief, as Naruto grunted, shaking his hand slightly to dissipate the smoke floating around it. Let's go then. The sooner we get started, the sooner I can massacre all the bandits between here and wherever it is we're going. Rule number 3. Our job is to protect Tazuna-san, not to hunt down bandits. Killing the ones that target us is fine, but we won't be actively hunting them down this time. Oh? In that case, I may as well have just stayed in bed today. What a waste of time. Naruto flipped up his hood and withdrew an ornate walking stick, grumbling to himself, as he started off, pausing only to glance up at a soft rustle in a tree. Several minutes passed in silence. Ah, such a nice day. Now is an excellent time for a lesson, Kakashi decided. I'm going to teach you a little about some random subjects, like the Kages, and our destination. Kakashi-sensei? Sakura ventured. Is this really relevant to guarding Tazuna-san? Before that though, I have a little story. It's about 3 genin and their instructor, out on their first C-rank mission. The instructor graciously decided to impart some of his wisdom to his students, but they didn't feel like listening. And so, their instructor had no choice but to thrash them severely, tie them up, hang them upside down from a tree branch, and lecture them for several hours before they could be on their way. Was the genin's unanimous statement on the matter. The moral of the story is don't question me, just shut up, and pay attention. Why yes, sensei. Right. Now where was I? Damn it, Sakura, you made me completely lose my train of thought, and Kakashi was interrupted, as a chain wrapped around him from nowhere, and tore him into 4 or 5 pieces. There was a moment of silence before Naruto asked what everyone was thinking. Sakura, did you just murder Kakashi with your mind? I didn't mean to, I swear. Just so you kids know, I'm still alive. Kakashi called down from a tree branch. The whole replacement technique thing, you know they just cut up a log. Ah? Naruto blinked. So they did? My mistake. So who's they? Kakashi wordlessly dropped 2 ninja to the ground, tied up tightly with their own chain. Naruto grinned, then blinked, and frowned. Kakashi-sensei, he whined. They're unconscious. It's no fun killing them if they're not terrified. Tazuna and Sasuke shuddered unanimously, and each took 1 large step away from the blonde. Ah well, dibs on the next fight. Sakura blinked, wondering just what the hell had just happened. After a quickly extracted confession from Tazuna, and a vote, they'd continued on to the ferry to Wave Country. Except it was less ferry, and more glorified canoe than anything else. You know, I've never been on a boat before, Naruto stated aloud. And if they're all like this, I don't think I ever want. Shut up, done, Sasuke hissed. Sound carries over water. You're going to get us caught. Eh? Oh, I get it. I wondered why everyone was so hush-hush. How about? He stood up abruptly, setting a foot on the side of the boat, as he cupped his hands around his mouth. Hey, Gatu! We're coming to kill you, Gatu! Gatu! There's nothing you can do about it, Gatu! Tried to stop us, Gatu! Sasuke was very nearly on the verge of tackling Naruto out of the ferry before he sat down again. You complete and utter moron, he hissed. What the hell are you thinking, you dash? Now before you get all shirty with me. Naruto interrupted, extending 1 finger. Listen closely. What do you hear? Or rather, what should you be hearing right now that isn't there for you to hear it? As Sasuke puzzled that last sentence out, Sakura blinked. Alarms after that outburst. There should definitely be some sort of alarm raised. If Gato's ships really are patrolling these waters properly, they are. Kakashi confirmed, sparing a moment to point out a few looming shapes in the mist that could, in all honesty, be anything. Sakura was easily convinced, however. My Hijitsu, Naruto said. One as well, I don't really feel like explaining the mechanics, and it's not like you would understand anyway. So let's say it makes something like an invisible barrier against sound, encapsulating a small area. Nothing in or out of course has its drawbacks in several situations. It'll break once we make landfall, and it can't be used too often. Why can't it? Sakura asked aloud, prompting a curious stare at Naruto from all parties of the boat. He grimaced. You know, Sakura, I have a story a lot like Kakashi's from earlier, except instead of beatings, ropes, and lectures, there's fatal stabbings, explosions, fire, and the desecration of corpses. Now, I'm going to pretend to forget you asked that question. Are you going to ask it again? She shook her head vigorously from side to side, and there was a long, awkward silence. We're making landfall. Kakashi spoke up eventually. About time. Naruto grunted. The sooner we get there, the sooner I can go drop Gatta's house on his head. No, that's not happening to Naruto. Just so we're all on the same page here, isn't it your job to protect me? Killing Gatta would. We weren't paid for an assassination mission, Tazuna-san. Technically you're correct, but I doubt that Gatta's left whatever place he's at unguarded, and we're only being paid for a C rank, to guard you against C rank dangers. So basically, if there's an infestation of rabid gerbils in your town, we're all over it. Until then, we're going to let the fights come to us. Well, I hear those rabid gerbils can get pretty nasty. Tazuna mumbled, disappointed, and uncomfortable with the Jounin's sarcasm. Silence fell before Sakura broke it. So, Naruto. Those things on your face, not that I was looking, but are they whiskers, or tattoos, or what are they? Naruto began an angry retort, but it died, as he actually thought about the question. You know, he realized. I actually have no idea. Duck. Kakashi interrupted blandly. Where? Sasuke asked, though he would later fervently deny having said anything. Kakashi grabbed him by the head, and dragged him to the ground, narrowly missing having bits removed by the giant sword that swung through the air above their heads almost immediately afterwards. It continued on away before lodging in a tree, where a ninja dropped down onto the handle, and began chuckling darkly. Naruto wasted no time in tugging his curved dagger back out. Yes, I can finally cut loose. Naruto, no! I recognize this opponent, he's A-class Momochi Zabuza, demon of the mist. Like I care. Ho ho ho, what's this? A worthless little genin? Boy, until you've made enough of. Naruto took advantage of Zabuza's impending monologue to call down a bolt of lightning from the cloudless sky, sending Zabuza scrambling to avoid it. What the hell? He howled. Victory goes to the one who wears the opponent down first. Naruto launched a snowball, which erupted into razor-sharp, jutting spears of ice next to Zabuza's feet. Hold still, that I might rend thee to dust. Meanwhile, Zabuza was sweating heavily, as he desperately maneuvered himself around the blonde's attacks. The situation was quickly taking a turn for the worse. Sharingan Kakashi hadn't even involved himself yet, and while he'd originally intended to write off all the genin as inconsequential, he could no longer afford to do so. Now would be a good time for Haku to implement Plan B. He no sooner thought it, than a handful zeroed in on his neck, and he barely managed to be impressed at the promptness before slumping to the ground. The masked boy flickered in next to Zabuza. You have my gratitude for occupying his attention. I've been waiting weeks for an opportunity to. Don't care. Naruto interrupted sourly. Fair warning, I've got a lot of aggression to work through, so if he isn't dead, I'm going to kill him messily now. If he is dead, then I'm going to messily decorate his body. At this point, whether or not I have to kill you first doesn't matter to me. But I'm a Kiri hunter Nin. Don't care. But in the interests of fairness, and because it'll amuse me, I'll let you make your case. You have 5 minutes. I need to take the body to be properly identified, and disposed of so that Kiri's secrets cannot be stolen from it. Tell you what, I'll peel his face off for you. I can assure you that there won't be enough of anything else left to be stolen either. Haku started to panic, grasping at any excuse to get away. He didn't find one. Time for Plan C. Here you go, he called, loosening a pouch at his side, part of the bounty for killing him. Catch. Haku tossed the pouch in a deliberate arc, and Naruto turned, and stepped to catch it before realizing the distraction for what it was, and snapping his gaze back to Haku, who'd formed a hand seal. No you don't! Magical missile. One shot. The sphere of light shot forward, coming to a halt for a moment in the fading afterimage of its target before it zipped off again. Got away. I'll kill him next time. Elsewhere, as Team 7 continued on to Tazuna's house, Haku received an unpleasant surprise, as he began to set Zabuza down for some impromptu field medicine, and the two of them were slammed into a nearby tree by the missile he thought that he'd left far behind. After spitting out a mouthful of blood, and checking to make sure that he hadn't actually bitten clear through his tongue, he unknowingly repeated Naruto's promise, except that his version was slurred somewhat, and utilized far-fouler language. Thanks for watching my video, and make sure to check out the author of this fanfic. Link is in the description. See you next time. Till then, sayonara.